Hei Ingrid.
Hei Jonas, velkommen tilbake fra Zanzibar.
Ja, tusen takk. Zanzibar og Dakar, Senegal. Og mellomlanding i Ghana. Og mellomlanding i Doha. Så hvis man... Og mellomlanding i Nairobi. Så jeg har jo sett halve verden egentlig.
Ja, globetrotter.
Ja, der har du meg. Denne episoden kommer til å komme ut i 2024. Men vi er i fortiden. Eller nåtiden, men i 2023, slutten av 2023, fordi vi spiller inn i dag fordi det passet best med gjesten vår da. Og 2023 er også et passende år å spille inn denne episoden egentlig, for det er 20-årsjubileet til Tax Justice Og Tax Justice Network var jo den første på en måte formelt stifta organisasjonen i Tax Justice-bevegelsen, som det etter hvert ble. Og etterpå så har det jo kommet en haug med andre organisasjoner i et sånt løst allianseopplegg. Blant annet der hvor jeg jobber, ikke sant? Tax Justice Norge og Tax Justice Network Afrika, og jeg møtte en fyr da jeg var i Dakar som jobbet i Tax Justice Ghana. Og ja, en haug med organisasjoner rett og slett. Men den originale Tax Justice Network ble altså stiftet i 2003.
Og i dagens episode av Pengeland har vi fått besøk av selveste Alex Cobham, som er daglig leder i The OG Tax Justice Network. Og vi har hooket tak i han fordi han er i Oslo nå i forbindelse med lansering av sin nye bok What Do We Know and What Should We Do About Tax Justice?
Ja, og vi skal snakke med Cobham om det store bildet. Om de siste 20 årene med Tax Justice Network og Tax Justice-bevegelsen. De neste 20 årene, kanskje. Få litt perspektiv fra han på fremtiden. Fordi han er jo en stor fyr, i hvert fall i bevegelsen. Da. Så er han en viktig fyr, så det er kult å få hans tanker om det store bildet. Da.
Og kjekt å få han i studio.
Ja, det er kult da. Det er ikke hver dag.
Nei.
All right, we are now joined by Alex Cobham. Alex, could you maybe start by telling the listeners who you are?
Well, thanks for having me. I'm Alex Cobham, you said that. I'm the Chief Executive of the Tax Justice Network, which is, I don't know, an organisation that has the absolute privilege to be part of the global movement pushing for, well, all the things that we're going to talk about, I'm sure.
Right. So, as we told our listeners in the intro, we are right now in 2023, even though the episode will be released in 2024. And in 2023, you celebrated, or the Tax Justice Network celebrated their 20th anniversary. Could you tell us sort of the origin story, how the Tax Justice Network got started?
Sure. There's a few strands, and it kind of depends who you ask to tell you the story, but I'll give you the good bits. So if you roll back to the end of the 1990s, at which point I'm a very, very, very junior researcher at Oxford University, but this isn't my story, I'm not involved, but it's one of the places where you're starting to see the first bits of research that really make the case that tax havens are a threat to development, and starting to frame tax abuse and tax justice as development questions. In 2000, you have the Oxfam white paper showing or putting a number for the first time on the amount of money that's lost by lower income countries to tax havens, and that's a key point. And some of the people who go on to be kind of early leaders in the Tax Justice Network are involved in the research for that at Oxfam, including Professor Sol Picciotto and John Christensen, who had formerly been the economic advisor to the British Crown Dependency of Jersey, and goes on to be the founding director of the Tax Justice Network. But the more exciting bit of this story is the bit when, after John has left Jersey, he goes to work in the UK. He's approached by some Jersey people, if you like, ordinary people from a small island that's dominated by finance and by fairly dirty finance at that. And they come to him and say, they've seen he's resigned and says that Jersey is kind of causing a problem for the world. They come to him a few years later and they say, we want you to save Jersey. Now these people, one of them runs a seaman's rest, a kind of mission for retired seamen. One of them is a retired nun, and the other is a primary school teacher who also teaches in the Jersey prison. Right? So they're normal people, nothing to do with tax, nothing to do with finance, nothing to do with campaigning. And they say to John, we want you to save Jersey from tax havenery. And John says, eventually, well, okay, but this will take a certain amount of money, and we can't just fix one tax haven. We have to fix the world. And these three people went away and they raised a significant amount of money just by doing, making cards and selling them and having a campaign in Jersey. And they put the founding money in to the Tax Justice Network. And without them, nothing that we've done since then would ever have happened. And I want to say one of them actually died last week, Pat Lucas, who was the primary school teacher. And we talk about Pat and Jean Anderson and Frank Norman, who died some time ago. But Pat and Jean particularly as the fire starters, the people who began what became the Tax Justice Network and in a sense catalyzed this global movement. Other people were working on this all around the world, but very often at a national level only. The joining up into a global movement, I think, doesn't happen without Frank and Pat and Jean. So perhaps we should dedicate this to Pat Lucas. What a legacy that is to have.
It's a fantastic story. And the organization has been involved in a lot of policy developments in the past 20 years. And, we have episodes on automatic exchange of information and on beneficial ownership transparency. And I'm sure there's a lot of stuff that's happened. But if there were to be made a Hollywood movie of the tax justice movement, which kind of key events would make it into the movie trailer, do you think? If it's possible to single out just a couple of
I suspect nobody will ever make that movie.
We can wish.
Actually, there is an ICRICT documentary coming soon, I think, which tells some of it. But look, I think there's two ways that you could tell that story. There's one that says, here's an organization that took the impossible and made it happen. And you talk about all the policy agenda that was put together in those early years. So automatic exchange of information on financial accounts, beneficial ownership transparency, country-by-country reporting by multinationals, even unitary taxation and formal apportionment, even moving tax into the United Nations. All of these things written off by people at the OECD, by national governments, finance ministries as completely impossible, unrealistic and utopian, never happen. And you can say, look, all of these things, they're happening. Look around, they're happening as we speak. I guess the other way, though, you could tell that story is to say none of these things have yet been delivered in a way that delivers on the fundamental goal. If you look at what's wrong with the world in terms of tax, it's that lower income countries face these enormous inequalities in their taxing rights. Sitting here in a very rich country, we know that this country, like pretty much every other, loses significant amounts of revenue to tax abuse of multinationals and people hiding assets and income streams offshore. But as a share of tax revenues, the losses are much more intense for lower income countries. They're much less able to exercise their taxing rights and to be effective states. Everything that we've delivered so far, largely through the OECD, has been delivered so partially in a way that lower income countries may actually face worse inequalities now. There's automatic exchange of information, but almost no lower income countries are included. There's beneficial ownership transparency for some companies and some other legal vehicles, but it's highly partial. There's country-by-country reporting, but it's private to tax authorities, not public, and most lower income countries' tax authorities never get to access that data at all. So potentially those inequalities have got worse because we've delivered these impossible policies through the OECD, through the Club of Rich Countries. And it's only in the last couple of years that we've really got this momentum building towards finally having a globally inclusive tax body under the auspices of the United Nations. Maybe when we get there, we can tell the story of absolute success, but not yet.
Not yet.
Right. You're here in Oslo now to promote your new book. What do we know and what should we do about tax justice? So given the title, there's maybe not a huge mystery what the book is all about. But maybe we could start with you telling us what you mean by the concept of tax justice, and then, what do we know about tax justice?
Sure. Tax justice, the kind of simplest way you can put it, is it's the absence of the ability of states to tax effectively. And that sounds very dry and boring and not like it matters for human beings. So let me put it a different way. We talk about the 4 R's of tax, and now 5. But the 4 R's of tax are these key things that tax delivers that give us the ability to live together in societies, to have better, longer, happier, healthier lives together, instead of living nasty, short, solitary, brutish lives alone. And that's why, we talk about tax as our social superpower. That's kind of how I start the book. We have this enormous power to give ourselves, all of us together, better lives, and we actually don't use it. In fact, we've created the conditions of tax injustice in which it's almost impossible for us to have these benefits. The fight for tax justice is about making them possible again. So the first R is revenue. Money for governments to spend, public services, administration, making markets work. All of this takes revenue. Redistribution is the second R. All of us live in societies with deep overlapping inequalities, in particular affecting women, people with disabilities, marginalized ethno-linguistic groups and so on. And the people at the intersections of those inequalities are especially far out of the benefits of our societies. Without the power of redistribution that tax gives us, we are much less able to address those inequalities. The third R of tax is repricing. It gives us the ability to change the relative price of things like tobacco consumption that have huge public health costs, or carbon emissions, which again threatens the planet we live on. Tax isn't the only answer for carbon emissions, but it's probably part of it. The fourth R, though, is the one that we, I think, most often overlook, and it's probably the most important: representation. When we pay tax, much though we may not like to, in fact, almost probably because we don't like to pay it, we feel empowered to hold our governments to account for how they spend the money. And we have this sense it's our money they're spending. And that's why, over time, almost the only thing you can find in all of the econometric evidence that is consistently associated with better governance, reduced corruption, governments that are more responsive to their people, is the share of tax in government spending. When governments can rely on other sources, like natural resource wealth or foreign aid, consistently and at a high level for a long period, it undermines their accountability to citizens. Tax is the thing that holds us together. It's the glue in the social contract. That's a nice thing to say, but the evidence really shows it's true. When governments rely more on tax, for the same level of total budget, they spend more of it on health. When a public health budget at the same level of spending relies more on tax than on other sources of government finance, that same amount of money spent on public health delivers better outcomes that are more inclusive of people on the margins of society. So there's this amazing magical power to tax. Even the same amount of money is better when it comes from tax. And yet, we continue to live in this world where particularly cross-border tax abuse by multinational companies and individuals undermines all of our states, not just their ability to raise revenue, but to deliver on each of those 4 R's. And maybe there is a fifth R, but we might come back to that later.
So I'd like to follow up on that concept you use, tax abuse, because we are usually talking about tax evasion and avoidance and making this distinction between what's legal and not legal. But in your book, you prefer the term tax abuse. Can you tell us a bit why?
It's partly because I got tired of having this conversation with tax lawyers about what in their mind seems to be a very clean line between evasion, that's criminal and illegal, and we certainly don't do that or recommend that to our multinational clients, and avoidance, and well, that's legal and that's perfectly fine. In truth, there is no such clean line. So one thing that you can say immediately is the effect of that is the same. It strips revenues away from states, whether it's technically legal or not. What you're achieving is a reduction in the taxes that you're paying in the place where you are making your money. So the impact is the same. It undermines the revenues and it undermines the government more broadly. But it's also not true that you can draw that hard line between them in terms of the legality. In fact, we know that the Big Four often will market schemes that have, in their view, less than a 50% chance even of being successful if they are challenged in court. Why do they do that? That doesn't, that's worse than flipping a coin and betting on the outcome, right? So why do they do that? They do it because they know they're not going to be challenged in court. They can push it further and further because governments, even highly resourced tax authorities in rich countries like this one, don't really like taking multinationals to court. They don't like the risk of losing. They don't like that they have to spend so much on lawyers and other professionals to keep up with the multinationals. And they don't like, for some politicians, the sense that this might make them look anti-business. What's anti-business is allowing multinationals to continue with this tax abuse because that puts domestic businesses at such a disadvantage. And it's domestic businesses that are responsible for the majority of employment and a great deal of the dynamism in our economies, and we allow them to be outcompeted by these tax abusive companies. So the term tax abuse allows us to put an umbrella over that. I don't want to argue with a tax lawyer from a multinational about whether this one particular scheme in this one particular country was technically lawful or not. I want to know that they're paying tax on the basis of declaring their profits in the country where they're making those profits. That's what I want. And, I'm going to call it abuse if you're not doing that, and you can tell me that some of it's legal, and well, okay. But I think we should all agree, and look, the G20 has already agreed that we should stop this. In 2013, the G20 gave the OECD one single goal: to reduce the misalignment between where multinationals have their economic activity and where they declare their profits and pay their taxes. The evidence shows us very clearly that the problem has got worse since then. And that's why we're back again saying, can the OECD deliver? Almost certainly not. What are we going to do instead? And look, it's the United Nations coming down the road of this conversation.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, that leads us nicely into the next question, which is basically the second half of the title of your book. What should we do about tax justice?
So, I've talked about some of the policy platform that the Tax Justice Network has developed over time. I think the key thing that that we've understood through the partial successes, or if you like, the failures, is that you can't deliver good policies through bad institutions. And with the best will in the world, the OECD is a bad institution. Or at least, let me be fair, it is a bad institution if we're asking it to provide a globally inclusive space for transparent, democratic decision-making. The OECD isn't that, was never designed to be that. And asking it to be that is kind of like, criticizing a fish for not being able to climb a tree, right? It's just not fair to the OECD or the, lots of very good people who work for the OECD. They are technical experts who were employed to provide analysis to a members club, a club of rich countries, not to oversee a global negotiation. The OECD doesn't have the governance to allow non-members to have the same rights as member countries. And nobody, including the OECD, should kid itself that it can do this without a complete change of its governance. We could look down that road and say, look, the OECD will eventually deliver fairly for all countries and with sufficient transparency that the worst effects of the lobbying behind closed doors are removed if we make all of these changes to its governance. But all of these changes would basically be turning the OECD into a UN institution. So we have another idea. There is a body in the world that was set up to allow for the negotiation between all countries of the world on complex issues with competing interests in transparency, ensuring governments are accountable to their own people as well as to each other, and it's the United Nations. We don't need to reinvent this. What we need is to give it back the power that the rich countries took away from it in 1960 when they created the OECD and gave it domain over taxes because they were worried that the newly independent countries at the UN were starting to think about how to tax their multinationals. Well, we need to tax their multinationals, and we need to tax them as much in the rich countries as in lower income countries. It's in all of our interests to get this right. And so that's where we are now. The Africa Group has led this work. Since the high-level panel on illicit financial flows out of Africa that completed its first major report in 2015, that in turn led to the world adopting a global target in the Sustainable Development Goals to reduce illicit financial flows and setting tax as the primary means of implementation for the entire framework, saying tax is central to all of our development hopes. That in turn came with a commitment from the rich countries to greater international tax cooperation, to reduce the inequalities in taxing rights faced by others, and to allow us all to do better. So far, nothing has been done. But we're at the point that it's just starting. 8 years later, the Africa Group has taken the lead, has brought a resolution last year to the United Nations to begin intergovernmental discussions on an international tax cooperation framework. The Secretary-General has delivered his report with the options, and this year the Africa Group has brought back and had successfully passed a resolution to set up a committee of member states to create the terms of reference for the negotiation of a framework convention on tax. And a framework convention, that's the key term. So it's not just a one-off convention that would give us some hope of moving on the ABC, automatic exchange, beneficial ownership, country by country. Not just those possibly quicker wins, but also creating a framework body, just as we have on climate, for regular conferences of the parties to come together, each country being equal and in transparency to be accountable to their citizens, to work out what we can do to fix the international tax rules, if not once and forever, then at least on a rolling basis, because people will always find new ways to treat the rules. But we can have a globally inclusive body to set those rules and to keep them up to date, and we can have something close to the conditions for tax justice in every country.
Now then, as I take it from this, that the working to create such a framework body in the UN is one of the things that are that will lie in the tax justice movement's future. Because I wanted to invite you to kind of speculate a bit about the next 20 years, because an anniversary such as this is a chance to look forward as much as looking back. Because some claim that maybe the tax justice movement has kind of become a victim of its own successes, right? That these ABCs that in 2003 were kind of like being laughed at as completely utopian ideas, they have on the surface been adopted. And as those of us who, work in this policy world, sometimes you can even meet progressive politicians who, when you speak to them, but like, oh, country by country reporting, we've already adopted that. And what's the next big thing, and that now there are lots of loopholes to fix and, more countries to include and regulations to implement. This kind of detail work is not as sexy a campaign strategy for a global advocacy movement as these big utopian goals. So what do you think the next 20 years of the tax justice movement will look like on policy work? Is it going to be more big utopian ideas like maybe a UN tax body that can actually work as a framework for setting tax policy, or will it have to be more on a like detailed regulation, closing the loopholes, fixing, and the continual battle back and forth between new loopholes that are identified by the people who want to abuse tax and catching up? So it's an invitation to be the wise sage of the tax justice movement now.
I reject this invitation.
Yeah.
but I can't help trying to answer the question all the same. In terms of the movement, the Tax Justice Network, I should have said this before, I think probably if in 100 years' time you're going to look back and say, did they achieve anything? I suspect the most important thing was just the catalytic contribution towards the creation of a movement. And now you have the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, the umbrella body for mass mobilization organizations all around the world. And that's really the movement. So we're kind of at one end doing research, communications, high-level advocacy, perhaps, but the Global Alliance is the movement. And if in 20 years there's no Tax Justice Network, that will be fine. If we've kind of done ourselves out of a job. And you can see, in a UN resolution, for example, could create something like a Centre for Monitoring Taxing Rights that the UN FACTI panel proposed a couple of years ago, that would do a lot of the work we do, assessing the damage that each country does in terms of creating tax abuse suffered by others, assessing the losses that each country suffer, and finding ways to use that data to generate policy to close those gaps. That could all be done within the UN system. It doesn't need a Tax Justice Network if we can get there. But I think the things that might still be lacking, certainly that the movement will still be vital for, is the stuff that's a little bit less concrete. It's not those immediate policy changes. Though I think you always need to be looking beyond the horizon. Now we're doing the stuff that was impossible 10 years ago. What are we coming up with now that's going to only become possible in 10 years' time? And we do need that, always to keep our eyes above the horizon, thinking what's coming. But the narrative shifts of what it's always been about. John Christensen always said that point. It's really, you can get a policy win, but if the narrative hasn't shifted, it's not going to stick. And we often see that. You get beneficial ownership transparency in the UK, but the government didn't really buy into it. So what do you get? You get a register of public information about the ultimate beneficial ownership of companies that is basically crap. So much of the information in there, because it's unverified, is very bad. It's better than nothing, but it's so much less better than nothing than it would have been if there'd been real political commitment all the way through. So the narrative, it's not just the policy. So what are the narratives? There's always the challenge from business. Don't tax us because we're creating growth or whatever it is. And we know taxation actually isn't a primary consideration for the location of investment, but companies will always be there trying to tell you that it is, trying to scare policymakers into reducing the tax burden. And the same with wealthy elites. So there always needs to be the pushback against that. We need to reduce inequality through taxation so we all live better lives. And it's not going to affect your incentives. No. The idea that high-income households react to tax incentives that might change their rate from 35 to 40% more than low-income households who already face marginal tax rates often of 60 and 70%. And somehow we don't care about that. This is the kind of thing that will always need to be pushed back against by a tax justice movement. But I think at the global level, it's the fifth R that my mind is drawn to. We've talked about how lower income countries face inequalities in their taxing rights. Effectively, instead of having the taxing rights over 100% of the economic activity that takes place in their jurisdiction, they only have taxing rights over, let's say, 50, 60%. And by implication, the high-income countries, including many of the major havens, many of the European Union member states, they have more than 100% of the taxing rights they should have. So this means this process that began several hundred years ago with formal empire and violent extraction has continued through into the current period of kind of a globalization of tax havenry with the same direction of travel. the extraction of wealth and resources from lower income countries into higher income ones. Now, the fifth R of tax justice is reparations. And the idea here, and this is a long-term agenda, but you can see very clearly that, a country like the UK can never repay what it's taken. Right. If the estimate is for what it took from India, from one country alone, is something like $45 trillion, right? The UK can never repay that. But that doesn't mean that we should throw our hands up in the air and say, well, bad luck. We've spent it. Sorry, you can't have it. We need to think creatively about how you find ways of repairing the injustice that's been done. And the only way you're going to get close to the amount of money is by thinking about similar periods of time. So how do you shift, how do you extract wealth back from the current and former imperial powers into former colonies without bankrupting somebody today and breaking the whole thing? Well, maybe it's the tax system. What if you were to say, in a system of unitary taxation, instead of giving everyone the right to tax in relation to 100% of the economic activity in their jurisdiction, lower income countries, former colonies, will have 110, 120% of the taxing rights. And we'll finance that by giving high-income countries perhaps 90, 95% only. Over time, we're going to start getting close. Given that we're talking at the minute of profit shifting in the trillions of dollars a year, there's money. there's gold in those hills. The question is whether we're creative enough and committed enough to actually use it to deliver on that final fifth R of tax justice. So 20 years from now, I would like to think we could be in a position where we have finally reversed the extractive flows of empire, with tax having a key role to play.
Great, wow.
That was a nice and optimistic note to end on, I think.
Inspiring, All right, Alex, thank you so much for coming to our podcast studio and joining us in Pengeland.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you. Da synes jeg ble en kjempefin samtale med Alex, Jonas. Jeg synes det var spesielt kul når starten av Tax Justice Network, at det var ikke noe savvy politiske konsulenter eller rådgivere, men at det var tre vanlige folk på Jersey, Pat og Gino, som var lei av å være et skatteparadis og samlet penger for å kunne starte det første Tax Justice Network, som nå 20 år senere har blitt en global bevegelse. Det litt sånn oppløftende om at det nytter selv med en liten innsats, med en håndfull av mennesker. Det utgjør en forskjell, da.
Skikkelig grasrot start.
Ja, det var skikkelig grasrot.
Det visste jeg ikke, faktisk. Ja. Og så det jo, han snakket jo også om, på en måte, du spurte jo veldig bra om, hva burde vi gjøre fremover, ikke sant? Burde vi sitte og loke i disse forskriftene og finne ut av sånn, nei, den kan ikke se sånn og sånn ut, eller den må se sånn og sånn ut, eller skal vi prioritere og tenke helt nytt, ikke sant? Og han ga jo litt sånn begge veier, ikke sant? Fordi det jo helt klart at vi har ikke ABC akkurat nå, ikke sant? Men det som du sa, ikke sant? At vi litt sånn offer for vår egen suksess, da, at det veldig lett å tro at vi har det, fordi vi har noen vedtak på det, vi har implementert noen ting, og så funker det ikke sant? Automatisk informasjonsutveksling som kom gjennom OECD, og som nå ligger i en del bilaterale skatteavtaler, men ikke alle, og det veldig forskjell på hva slags informasjon man får, og ikke sant, skatteparadis som Sveits sier, nei, vi kan ikke gi denne informasjonen til enkelte utviklingsland, fordi vi stoler ikke på at de har kapasiteten til å motta det, og likevel sikre personvernet, og det kan til og med være et legitimt argument, men poenget ikke sant, vi ikke helt der ennå. Og på reelle rettighetshavere, altså vi igjen spiller inn i desember nå, da, men det kommer jo nettopp et lovforslag om å innskrenke innsynsmuligheten til det norske registeret, i hvert fall i første omgang, og så skal det komme en mer forskriftsarbeid for å gi de med legitim interesse innsyn. Men ideelt sett så ønsker vi å ha dette på et at allmenningen, alle sammen, skal få innsyn. Men vi så langt fra det i Norge nå. Det jo ganske absurd, fordi det et så eldgammelt stortingsvedtak. Ikke sant? Så det masse jobb igjen å gjøre, og land-for-land-rapportering, ikke minst. Der har vi jo Og da 3 regelverk I Norge og 2 vedtak som fortsatt ikke innført, og vi har et EU-direktiv som fullt av hull som plutselig kommer til å komme inn nå. Ikke sant? Så masse detaljarbeid som må gjøres for å få på plass velfungerende A, B og C. Og det I hvert fall det jeg føler jeg gjør mest nå, ikke sant? Det blir ikke så mye tid til å tenke på det store bildet da, men da var det jo veldig kult at han likevel, han trakk det veldig opp på høynivå da.
Og da synes jeg også fint både med å liksom lese bok og denne praten og gå tilbake til disse 4, kanskje 5 ærene med skatter, og snakke om at liksom, for jeg også jobber I feltet der han snakker om liksom, at land må være flinkere til å låne penger, og at det ikke så farlig med pengetrykking. Det veldig mange sånne tabuer som flytter I det siste året, og blir påminnet om hvorfor skatteinntekt så viktig for staten. Og han viser at det veldig masse fin forskning på det, at selv for land som har liksom lik inntektsnivå, for da landet som har inntekten sin for skatt heller enn for bistand, eller for olje, eller for lån for utenlandske kreditorer, så for da landet som har inntekten I skatt, så går de inntektene I større grad til for eksempel offentlig helse, og du får bedre mer inklusiv offentlig pengebruk, så det liksom kommer til gode de marginene I samfunnet, hvor viktig det med ikke bare liksom skatteinntekt som revenue eller inntekt for staten den første æren, men den 4. æren, representasjon da, at da å betale skatt liksom en så grunnleggende del av samfunnskontrakten, at som han sa, det ingen av oss som kjempeglad I å betale skatt, men når du gjør det, så får du på en måte, blir du investert I staten, og I hva den gjør for deg, og hvilke type tjenester den leverer, hvor viktig det og at vi må passe oss for å som han skriver I bok også, liksom at det derfor kjempeviktig å ha det som liksom både som skatt på inntekt og skatt på formue, som liksom skatter vi virkelig legger til merke til, som liksom skaper gode demokratiske relasjoner og diskusjoner om hva vi skal bruke pengene til, og at ikke vi bare sniker det unn I mer sånn I moms og andre avgifter og sånn mer usynlige skatter, men hvor viktig det for samfunnskontrakten og demokratiske relasjoner at vi har gode ordninger for både inntektsskatt og formueskatt. Den representasjonsdelen, da blir liksom påminnet the big picture. Hvorfor dette viktig? Og vi har vel begge en tendens til å liksom drukne litt I detaljene.
Ja, det kan du si. Ja, og I tillegg så klarte han jo å trekke opp den 5. æren av hatten, ikke sant, til slutt. Så vi fikk en veldig kul...
Den nye æren, ja.
Den nye kule æren. Vi fikk jo en litt sånn kul form på samtalen med han egentlig, fordi vi startet liksom med han tisa litt at ja, det jo en 5. ære også, men så skal jeg bare gå igjen de 4 ærene, og så nevnte han det igjen, og så på slutten så fikk vi sånn her, reparations, ikke sant? Det den nye store greia, som han tester litt stemningen for da. Og det et veldig kult konsept, for når man tenker på det, så følger det jo litt naturlig av den ambisiøse ideen, da, som jo var utopisk, men kanskje ikke så mye, altså som virker mer og mer realistisk. Da. Dette målet med alt det vi gjør, ABC, ikke sant? Enhetlig skattlegging, som jo, hvor tanken at man skal gå vekk fra muligheten til å bare bokføre seg ut av skatteplikt I landet hvor du synes det litt for høy skatt, ikke sant? Og gå over til sånn at man ser helhetlig på hele konsernet, og sier sånn, ja, altså, du hadde så mye produksjon der, så mye verdier og kapital der, så mye salg der, ikke sant? Og så kan man skattlegge selskapet ut ifra det da, og virkelig fordele på en mye mer rettferdig måte enn vi muliggjør I dag, med liksom et nasjonalt skattesystem og et globalt økonomisk system. Og det neste stegen jo å tenke, ja ok, når vi har enhetlig skattlegging, hvordan kan vi da fikse de skjevfordelingene som I den globale økonomien I dag da, ved å liksom vekte for eksempel utviklingsland litt tyngre da, eller som han også nevnte til oss faktisk, at det man også kunne gjøre å vekte det ut ifra befolkning, ikke sant? Jo større befolkning det I det her landet, jo mer salg har du I det landet, liksom. Så da kan du vekte det ettersom det. Så masse teknisk arbeid som må gjøres for å gjøre denne ideen mer realistisk, men det kult at gjennom hele historien av Tax Justice-bevegelsen så ser vi utopiske ideer som blir muliggjort, og som blir hakket mer realistiske etter hvert som det går, og nå vi på skikkelig detaljnivå på ABC-ene som startet som utopiske ideer.
Så synes du det fint tanke at liksom, for oss jo liksom enhetlig skattlegging og alle disse ABC-ene en måte å liksom stoppe urettferdigheten som innebygd i det internasjonale skattesystemet der, som Alex sa, at hvor det handler om å liksom ta verdier ut for utviklingsland og gi det til de rikeste landene og de rikeste selskapene, men at også å se det i kontekst om at dette her en lang historisk prosess der rådende internasjonale skattereglene og skatteregimer bare viderefører maktrelasjoner som har vært i hundrevis av år for periodagene, og et nytt skattesystem kan ikke bare liksom stoppe, ok, nå skal vi stoppe urettferdigheten, men at vi kan kompensere også, og kan bruke et nytt skattesystem for å betale en eller annen form for erstatning for den urettferdigheten, da, the tax injustice, som har blitt gjort nå i 100 år.
Tax Injustice Norge. Yes, det var det vi rakk for denne episoden av Pengeland. Vår gjest i studio var legenden Alex Cobham, sjef i Tax Justice Network. Lyd og musikk og video som alltid produsert av Kristoffer Lislegård. I studio i dag var du, Ingrid Hjartaker, fra Høgskolen Innlandet, og meg, Jonas Veland, fra Tax Justice Norge. Pengeland en podcast produsert av og for Tax Justice Norge, og du kan lytte til hver episode der du hører podcast eller se det på YouTube. På gjenhør. Hei Ingrid.
Hei Jonas, velkommen tilbake.
Takk. Hvor har jeg vært?
Zanzibar, tror jeg, angivelig.
Du har rett.